The smell hit her first. Old wood, rain, and something else beneath it all, something clean and sharp like steel. The floorboards of the Tokyo apartment sighed under her weight, a low groan of protest. It was bigger than the online listing had shown, the main room stretching into shadows that the single bare bulb overhead could not penetrate. A thick layer of dust coated everything, dancing in the slanted afternoon light that sliced through a grimy window. It was perfect, and at a price that made no sense in a city like this. It was also deeply suspicious. Her German shepherd, Zeus, seemed to agree. He padded silently around the perimeter of the room, his black nose twitching, his ears swiveling to catch the distant hum of Shinjuku traffic. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a constant thrum of warning. "It's fine, boy," Chloe murmured, her voice swallowed by the high ceilings. She dropped her single duffel bag and the worn backpack that held her entire life onto the floor. At 18, with a scholarship that barely covered tuition and a part-time convenience store job that paid for instant noodles, this was a miracle. A dusty, creaking, probably haunted miracle. She ran a hand over the worn denim of her jeans, leaving a faint streak of grime. Her light pink shirt felt flimsy and out of place in the solemn, aged space. This building felt important, ancient, even as the city screamed its modernity outside the window. The landlord had been brief. An email with a key code and a single sentence. "Rent is due in cash on the 1st of the month. Do not be late." No name, no meeting. Just an account number and a warning. That was the moment everything changed. Not with a bang, but with a sound so quiet it was almost imaginary. The click of a well-oiled lock from the floor above. Zeus froze, the growl in his chest cutting off abruptly. He turned his head, a statue of muscle and fur, and stared at the ceiling. Chloe held her breath, listening. Footsteps. Measured, silent, and heavy. They were not the shuffling steps of an elderly neighbor. They were deliberate, each one landing with an unnerving certainty. They moved across the floor above and then began to descend a staircase she hadn't noticed, one tucked away in the shadows near the back wall. She backed away slowly, her hand reaching down to rest on Zeus's powerful neck. His hackles were raised. He knew. A man emerged from the darkness. He did not look like a landlord. He looked like he owned the very air in the room. He was Japanese, his face a collection of sharp, unforgiving angles. A thin, white scar cut clean through his left eyebrow, a deliberate flaw in an otherwise perfect, severe mask. His suit was a dark, charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the light, tailored so precisely it looked more like a second skin than clothing. As he moved into the single beam of light, she saw the details. The subtle gleam of a platinum watch, the sliver of intricate, swirling blue and black ink peeking out from beneath the starched white cuff of his shirt. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes, dark and flat as polished obsidian, sweeping the room. They took in the dust, the single bag, her and the dog. They lingered on Zeus for a half-second longer than they lingered on her. His stillness was absolute, a predator waiting for the world to come to him. "You are the new tenant," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low, a gravelly baritone with no trace of an accent, and it filled the space between them effortlessly. Chloe found her own voice, surprised it came out steady.
"Yes, Chloe.
I wasn't expecting anyone. I live upstairs," he said, as if that explained the suit and the silence and the feeling that the temperature in the room had just dropped 10 degrees. He took a step forward. Zeus shifted his weight, a nearly inaudible rumble starting in his chest again. The man's eyes flicked down to the dog, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He is well trained. He's protective. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He was assessing her and she was failing the test. She could feel it. She was just a broke college kid, an outsider who had stumbled into a place she clearly did not belong. She should have known the rent was too good to be true. That is when she made the mistake of looking up, past his shoulder, toward the front door of her apartment. Through the grimy glass panel, she saw them. 2 men in dark suits, their silhouettes stark against the afternoon light. They were not delivering a package. They moved with a synchronized, fluid menace, their hands tucked inside their jackets. Her landlord saw the direction of her gaze. He did not turn. He did not startle. A subtle tension entered his shoulders, the only sign that he was even aware of them. "Get back," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more commanding than a shout. Before she could process the order, the world exploded. The glass in the door didn't just break, it vaporized into 1,000 tiny shards as the wood splintered inward. The sound was deafening, a physical blow that threw Chloe off balance. She stumbled back, her hands flying up to cover her ears. Zeus erupted into a frenzy of furious barking, a wall of sound and teeth between her and the door. The man, her landlord, moved. He moved like violence was a language he was born speaking. In one liquid motion, he had a gun in his hand, a black, brutalist piece of metal that seemed to appear from nowhere. He did not raise his voice. He did not hesitate. He fired twice. Two sharp, contained cracks that were surgically precise. One of the men in the doorway grunted and fell backward, out of sight. The other dove for cover. Her landlord grabbed her arm. His grip was like steel. He didn't pull her, he relocated her, spinning her behind him and shoving her toward the shadowed staircase he'd just ascended.
Go. Now.
Zeus, loyal to a fault, stayed at her side, barking and snapping at the open doorway, a furious guardian refusing to yield. "Zeus, come," she screamed, her voice raw with panic. The second intruder reappeared, firing blindly into the room. Plaster exploded from the wall near her head. Without thinking, she dropped to the floor, dragging Zeus down with her by his collar. Her landlord was already moving again, a dark wraith against the light. He fired once more, a choked cry, then silence. The sudden quiet was more terrifying than the noise. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and dust. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her landlord stood over the two bodies in the doorway, his posture unchanged. He was not breathing heavily. He looked down at the weapon in his hand as if it were a common tool, then tucked it away inside his jacket. He turned, and his dark eyes found her crouched on the floor, clinging to her dog. She stared at him, at the calm, lethal certainty in his posture. Landlords did not move like that. They did not kill men in their doorways without breaking a sweat. "You saw this," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He walked toward her, his expensive leather shoes leaving prints in the dust. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at her. The predatory stillness was back, but now it was focused entirely on her. She was not a tenant. She was a witness, a complication. "You cannot leave," he said. "They saw your face. If you walk out that door, you are dead before you reach the end of the block." Her cheap, miraculous apartment had just become a cage. And the man in the flawless suit, the one who held her life in his perfectly steady hands, was the keeper. The days that followed blurred into a tense, silent routine. Her world shrank to the four walls of the dusty apartment and the silent, imposing presence of the man upstairs. His name, she learned from a brief, clipped introduction, was Tatsuya. He never offered more, and she never asked. Men in dark suits, quiet and watchful, were a constant presence now. They stood in the hallways by the main entrance, their presence a suffocating blanket of security that felt more like imprisonment. They brought her food in plain containers, textbooks for the classes she was now missing, and high-quality kibble for Zeus. It was all unnervingly domestic. No one spoke to her. They would nod, set the items inside her door, and retreat. Tatsuya remained upstairs. She would hear his footsteps sometimes, late at night, a steady pacing back and forth, the sound of a caged tiger. The initial shock gave way to a gnawing fear, but Chloe was a survivor. She cleaned the apartment, scrubbing away the dust and grime until the old wood gleamed. It was an act of defiance, of reclaiming some small piece of control. Zeus was her shadow, his reassuring warmth a constant comfort. He seemed to have accepted Tatsuya's presence, his initial aggression replaced by a wary, watchful respect. One evening, a week after the shooting, the power went out. The building plunged into an immediate, profound darkness. The hum of the city outside seemed to die away, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Zeus whined softly, pressing against her leg. Before panic could set in, a thin beam of light cut through the blackness from the staircase. Tatsuya stood there, holding a small, powerful flashlight. "Stay here," he commanded. He moved past her, his footsteps silent on the floorboards she had just polished. He went to the window, peering through the blinds into the street below. He stood there for a long time, a silhouette against the faint glow of the city. "It's not just our building," she found herself saying, her voice small in the dark. "The whole block is out." He turned, the flashlight beam catching the sharp planes of his face. "It does not matter. It provides an opportunity." That was when she realized he was hurt. In the stark, unforgiving light of the flashlight, she saw a dark stain spreading across the side of his pristine white shirt, just below his ribs. He had been hiding it under his suit jacket. He swayed, just for a second, catching himself against the wall. "You're bleeding," she said, her own fear momentarily forgotten. "It is nothing," he bit out, his voice strained. "It's not nothing. You're going to pass out." She moved toward him, her professional instincts from a brief flirtation with nursing school kicking in. "Let me see." He fixed her with a glare that should have sent her running. "Do not touch me." But she saw the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the slight tremor in his hand. This man who moved like a phantom, who dealt in death with surgical precision, was vulnerable. And, in that moment, she had a choice. The front door was unguarded. The men outside were likely focused on the power outage, on securing the perimeter. She could grab her bag, grab Zeus, and run. She could disappear into the darkened city and never look back. She looked at the blood seeping through his shirt. She thought of the way he had moved to put his body between her and the bullets. He had saved her life. Chloe made her choice. "Sit down before you fall down," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. To her shock, he hesitated, then slowly slid down the wall to sit on the floor. Zeus padded over, sniffing at Tatsuya's hand before lying down near his feet, a silent, furry sentinel. She retrieved the small first aid kit from her backpack. It wasn't much, but it was something. Kneeling in front of him in the dark, the flashlight propped on a table and aimed at the ceiling for ambient light, the world shrank to the space between them. "I need you to take off the jacket and the shirt." He watched her, his expression unreadable, but he complied. The jacket came off first, then he slowly unbuttoned the shirt. The wound was angry and red, crudely stitched but clearly infected. It was a deep gash, not a bullet wound. Something from a knife. "This needs to be cleaned properly," she said, her voice clinical and calm, a mask for the tremor in her own hands. She worked carefully, cleaning the wound with antiseptic wipes from her kit. He never flinched, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, the rigid control he exerted over his own body. His skin was warm beneath her fingers. As she worked, she saw it.
The ink. It was not just a small piece on his wrist.
It was a masterpiece of shadow and color, a tapestry of dragons and water that covered his entire torso and arms. It moved with his muscles, a living, breathing work of art that spoke of a world she could barely imagine. Her fingers brushed against the uninked skin near the wound. He drew a sharp, involuntary breath. Her gaze shot up to his. His eyes were no longer flat and cold. In the dim, bouncing light, they were dark pools of something complex, pain, exhaustion, and something else she could not name. They were so close she could feel the heat from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a mix of hinoki wood and smoke, now mingled with the metallic tang of blood. The silence in the room was a physical weight, charged with everything unsaid. She finished dressing the wound, her movements economical and precise. "It's the best I can do," she whispered. "You need antibiotics." He just stared at her, his gaze intense. He did not thank her. He did not say a word. But the way he looked at her had changed. He was no longer just seeing a witness, a problem to be managed. He was seeing her. The power flickered back on an hour later, flooding the room with harsh, yellow light. The moment of intimacy was shattered. Tatsuya rose to his feet, his movements stiff. He put his shirt and jacket back on, hiding the wound and the art that lay beneath. He walked to the stairs, then stopped and looked back at her. "The men who did this," he said, his voice back to its usual cold, flat tone, "belong to the Kuroda clan. They do not see you as a witness anymore. They see you as a possession. My possession. They will try to take you to prove I am weak." He let the words hang in the air, a death sentence and a declaration. Then he turned and disappeared up the stairs, leaving her alone in the sudden, blinding light. She could have run. She had her chance. But as she sank to the floor and buried her face in Zeus's warm fur, she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she was no longer looking for an escape. The fragile peace of their strange cohabitation was shattered 2 nights later. Tatsuya had been recovering, the infection in his side slowly receding thanks to a silent delivery of medical supplies that appeared at her door. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant hum in the background of her life. He would watch her sometimes from the top of the stairs as she sketched in her notepad, an art history student with no museum to go to. She caught him once, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. He didn't look away. Neither did she. The attack, when it came, was not on him. It was on her. One of Tatsuya's men, a young man named Ichiro with kind eyes, had been taking Zeus for his brief, necessary walks in the walled garden behind the building. Chloe stood at her window, watching the big dog joyfully chase a fallen leaf, a small moment of normalcy in a life that was anything but. Then she saw the flicker of movement on the rooftop opposite. A glint of metal. Not a gun. A lens. They were watching her. A cold dread washed over her. Before she could shout a warning, it was too late. 2 figures dropped from the garden wall with athletic silence. They moved on Ichiro with brutal efficiency. It was over in seconds. Ichiro was down, and one of the men was lunging for Zeus's leash. Zeus, however, was not just a pet. He was a protector. He met the man's lunge with a snarl that was pure fury, his teeth sinking into the man's forearm. The man screamed, trying to shake him off. The second intruder pulled a knife and moved toward the dog.
Chloe didn't think.
She acted. She spun away from the window, grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a cast-iron skillet from the small kitchen, and bolted for the door, screaming Tatsuya's name. She flew down the back stairs and burst into the garden just as Tatsuya and 2 of his men came from the main house. The scene was chaos. Zeus had the first man pinned, his arm bleeding freely. The second man was advancing on the dog with the knife, his attention divided. Tatsuya saw the knife. He saw the man's trajectory toward Zeus, toward her as she ran into the fray. The cold control that defined him vanished, replaced by a terrifying, focused rage. He moved faster than she could have imagined, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He didn't use his gun. His movements were a blur of vicious, close-quarters combat. An elbow to the throat, a knee to the ribs. The man with the knife went down with a sickening crunch. The first man, finally shaking Zeus off, scrambled for a weapon. Chloe didn't hesitate. She swung the heavy skillet with all her might, connecting with the side of his head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Silence fell, broken only by Zeus's panting and the pained groans of Ichiro. Tatsuya stood over the 2 intruders, his chest heaving, the mask of calm utterly gone. His eyes, burning with a black fire, found hers. He strode toward her, grabbing her by the shoulders, his grip bruising. He wasn't gentle. He was frantic, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a raw rasp.
No, I'm fine.
He pulled her against him, a rough, desperate embrace that was less about comfort and more about confirming she was real, that she was there. His hand tangled in her hair, holding her head against his shoulder. She could feel the wild thumping of his heart against her cheek. He was shaking. The invincible, untouchable man was shaking. Later, after Ichiro had been carried inside and the two intruders dragged away, they stood in the silent apartment. The skillet was still on the floor where she dropped it. They brought one of the intruders to him, the one she had hit. He was tied to a chair in the center of her living room, defiant and spitting insults. Tatsuya's men tried to question him, their methods direct and brutal. But the man was loyal or terrified of his own boss and said nothing. Tatsuya watched, his face carved from stone. Chloe watched too, her stomach churning. This was his world. Blood and pain and broken bones. She should have been repulsed. But all she felt was a cold, simmering anger that these men had tried to hurt her dog, that they had tried to use her to get to Tatsuya. The man in the chair sneered at her. The boss will enjoy breaking his new toy. Something inside, Chloe snapped. She walked forward, ignoring the surprised look from one of Tatsuya's men. She circled the chair, looking at the intruder not as a monster, but as a man. She saw the cheap watch on his wrist, the nervous way he kept flexing his fingers. She saw the faint, faded tattoo of a woman's name on his neck, partially hidden by his collar. "You're afraid of him," she said softly. The man scoffed. "Not of Tatsuya. Of your own boss. You're more afraid of what he'll do if you talk than what will happen to you here." She stopped in front of him.
He sent you for me.
A woman. An unarmed civilian. Is that the kind of work the great Kuroda clan does now? Sending men to attack dogs and college students. The man's jaw tightened. "He told you Tatsuya was weak," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But you're the one who failed. You couldn't even handle one girl and her dog. When your boss finds out how pathetic you are, what do you think he will do to the woman whose name is on your neck?" His eyes widened in panic. That was the crack she was looking for. She had crossed a line. She was using the brutal logic of their world against them. Tatsuya stood perfectly still, watching her, a strange, almost proud light in his dark eyes. The man broke. He told them everything. The location of the safe house. The name of the lieutenant in charge. The entire plan. After he was taken away, the silence in the room was different. It was a shared space, a territory they now occupied together. Tatsuya walked over to her, stopping so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He gently touched the side of her face, his thumb tracing her jawline. His touch was no longer rough or frantic. It was deliberate, a claim. "I told myself keeping you here was for your protection," he said, his voice a low murmur that vibrated through her. "That was a lie." Her breath hitched. "What was it then?" "It was for mine." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "You see the monster, and you do not run. Instead, you hand him a sharper sword." The confession hung between them, more dangerous and intimate than any declaration of love. "That makes you my weakness." "No," she whispered, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, over the steady beat of his heart. "It makes me yours." The final confrontation was inevitable. The information she had pulled from the captured soldier was a map to the heart of the enemy's plan. They were planning to ambush Tatsuya during a supposed neutral meeting. They would use her as the catalyst, parading her as proof of his weakness before they killed him. But now, the trappers were about to become the trapped. Tatsuya's plan was audacious and lethal. He would go to the meeting, but he would not be walking into an ambush. He would be the one setting the terms. And he wanted her nowhere near it. "You will stay here," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for debate. "The building will be locked down. You will be safe." "They won't believe you're weak if I'm not there," Chloe argued, standing before him in the main room of her apartment. "They'll know it's a trap." "I do not care. I will not risk you." "You're risking everything if you go in there with a flawed plan," she shot back. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between the cold tactician and the man who had held her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored.
She took a breath.
"Let me be the flaw they don't see coming." He finally relented, not because she had convinced him, but because he knew she was right. The meeting was in an abandoned warehouse by the Tokyo docks, the air thick with the smell of salt and rust. She was the bait. She sat in a car a block away with Ichiro, whose arm was now in a sling, and watched Tatsuya walk into the building alone. The plan was for her to be discovered by Kuroda's men, a helpless victim to be dragged inside. But as the minutes ticked by, a sick feeling grew in her stomach. It was too quiet. A message crackled over Ichiro's radio. Kuroda wasn't in the warehouse. He was in a crane control booth overlooking the entire yard, watching. It was a trap within a trap. He was going to bring the whole building down on Tatsuya and his men. He's going to kill them all. Ichiro breathed, his face pale. Chloe looked at the towering crane, then at the warehouse. There was no time. She grabbed the radio from Ichiro's hand. "Zeus," she said, her voice sharp and clear. Tatsuya had insisted the dog stay with one of his men near the warehouse entrance, hidden from sight.
Zeus.
Shuji master. It was the one word she had taught him in Japanese, a command tied to Tatsuya. It meant find him, protect him. Through a pair of binoculars, she saw the handler release the dog. Zeus shot from the shadows like a black missile, a silent, four-legged weapon, straight for the warehouse entrance Tatsuya had used. Then she turned to Ichiro. "Get me to that crane." She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't a killer. But she was smart. As Ichiro sped toward the base of the crane, she saw the power box, thick cables running from it up to the control booth. While Tatsuya's men engaged the guards below, Chloe slipped through the chaos. With the heavy wrench Ichiro had given her from the car's toolkit, she smashed the emergency shutoff, prying the cover open and yanking on the thick lever inside. The groan of the massive crane ground to a halt. High above, the door to the control booth flew open, and Kuroda stared down, his face a mask of fury. He had been so focused on the battle below, he hadn't seen the girl. His mistake. The distraction was all Tatsuya needed. Inside the warehouse, the sudden appearance of Zeus had thrown the ambush into chaos. The dog, a blur of teeth and fury, had taken down the man closest to Tatsuya, giving him the split second he needed. The battle was short and brutal. When Tatsuya emerged from the warehouse, he was covered in dust and blood, some of it his own. But he was alive. His eyes scanned the chaotic scene, and then they found her, standing by the silent crane, the heavy wrench still in her hand. The world seemed to fall away until it was only the two of them. A cost had been paid. Two of his best men were dead. His own arm was broken, a makeshift splint already tied around it. The war with the Kuroda clan was far from over. But they had survived the night. He walked toward her, his expression unreadable. He stopped in front of her and gently took the wrench from her hand, letting it fall to the ground with a clang. He looked at the grease on her fingers, the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. He didn't speak. He simply reached out with his good hand and cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. His acknowledgement was not in words. It was in the reverence of that touch, in the raw emotion swirling in his dark eyes. They had come for her to prove he was weak. He looked at her now, as if she were the source of all his strength. Later, back in the quiet sanctuary of the apartment, the city lights of Shinjuku spread out below them like a carpet of fallen stars. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. He stood behind her as she looked out the window, his presence a warm, solid wall at her back. He had not let her out of his sight since the docks. The ordinary world she had known, the world of a poor college student struggling to get by, was gone. It had vanished the moment she chose to stay, the moment she picked up that skillet. There was no going back. Tatsuya placed something cool and heavy in her hand. She looked down. It was a single, ornate key. Not to her apartment. It was older, more intricate. A master key. He said nothing. He didn't need to. It wasn't a promise of love or a future. It was a statement of fact. This was her home now. This was her life. This dark, dangerous, violent world was hers to claim or to refuse. She closed her hand around the key, the cold metal warming against her skin. The rent for this life was impossibly high. The price was everything she had been and everything she thought she would be. She looked at his reflection in the glass, at the fierce, possessive loyalty in his eyes. And for the first time since coming to this city, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged.